Hello there. I'm Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza, journalist and contributing editor at From Day One, our forum on corporate values. Welcome to our webinar today, which is titled HR Planning and Budgeting 2025, How to Maximize Your Employee Experience Investment. Before we get started for today's attendees, and that is you, we have some complimentary VIP tickets available for one of our monthly virtual conferences coming up later this month. We'll be exploring the topic, modernizing your workplace for a more flexible, inclusive era. Here's what that one's about. The arrival of hybrid work sent virtually every employer back to the drawing board about what the workplace should look like, including floor plans, digital platforms, meetings, and even office furniture. After more than 3 years of experimenting, what have innovative companies discovered about what works and what doesn't? And how have they improved workplace environments to be healthier as well as more productive? And how have these changes affected the goals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Join us on October 16th, that's next week, to find out. I'm putting a link in the chat now to access complimentary VIP tickets to that virtual conference, including access to the whole day's activities. The regular price for our conference tickets is $149, so don't miss out on this opportunity, and I hope we'll see you there. Now, today, we'll be talking about HR Planning and Budgeting 2025, how to maximize your employee experience investment. This session will help you pinpoint key focus areas to enhance employee experience, from leveraging new technologies to refining strategic pillars. We'll share practical examples of budget allocation to ensure the highest return on investment and offer insights on measuring the success of your initiatives. You'll receive expert advice on creating a flexible planning process that aligns with your organizational goals and prepares you for future challenges. Today's webinar is presented with support from WorkTango, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. WorkTango is an award-winning employee experience platform that helps leaders and organizations improve employee engagement, increase retention, and boost performance while reducing costs with employee surveys and recognition and reward software. WorkTango is built for the workplace we all want to be a part of, where teams accomplish great things, achievements are celebrated, and employees have a voice. Now, before we get started, a few more logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with that link. That same email will have information on how you can get professional development credits for this session from both the Society of Human Resource Management, that's SHRM, and the HR Certification Institute, or HRCI. And look out for a written account of the conversation on our website at fromdayone.co. Around 45 minutes into this webinar, I'll be moderating a Q&A session with our speaker, Rob Catalano. You can submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And remember, this webinar is designed to be of service to you. So please send us questions and we'll do our best to get to all of them. With all of that said, we'll meet today's speaker. Leading this webinar will be Rob Catalano, WorkTango's Chief Marketing and Strategy Officer. Rob, happy to have you. I'll kick it over to you to get started.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. An introduction. Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here. Do a lot of work with the From Day One team. I've met a lot of you potentially at events around there, but thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules and days to come up for air, see what else is out there, learn something new. Huge appreciation from Day One giving us the opportunity to do that together. I know that the topic was introduced, HR Planning and Budgeting 2025. I want to talk a bit about how to maximize your employee experience investment today. But the thing that came to mind and dawned on me this week, coming back from holiday, was that, can you believe 2025 is literally around the corner? Like it is weeks away. And it's crazy how fast the year goes when we're all plugging away, trying to grow our companies and create great experiences. And when I first thought of 2025 and started, doing some research, the first thing I saw that popped up on my screen was 2025 is the year of the snake. Now, what's interesting about that is when I dug a little deeper, I'm curious, what is the year of the snake? It's actually associated through the Chinese zodiac as wisdom, charm, elegance, transformation. What I thought was also interesting is people born in the year of the snake are believed to be intuitive and strategic and intelligent. And two things really stood out to me when I read this. One was transformation. Like there's so much transformation happening in our organizations, right? How do we navigate what's changing from a technology perspective through major change management, challenges with the economy? And the last part was strategic, right? Hopefully, your 2025 plans and beyond, or your 3 and 5 year visions are strategic, right? And supporting a lot of the changes out there. So the reality is, though, is we can't wait till 2025 to start talking about it and thinking about all of this stuff, right? That old adage, right? It takes 9 months to create a baby. Well, it may not take 9 months to build your plan, but it really starts now, right? We can't wait until then to define what it's going to look like, what success looks like, and how we're going to invest more or less or change that to drive what we're trying to drive. So, 2025 is around the corner, but companies are now looking at plans and budgets to identify how are we going to invest to build a better experience and hit all the goals and accomplishments you want to see when we start 2026. So it's that time of year, right? We're talking about budgets. And since we're using all the adages like before, we're also talking about planning. And I'm a true believer that if we just go into next year without a very solid, well thought, aligned plan, the old adage, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. That's typically where people come when they don't give it some exercise of thought. So that all being said, and setting up the conversation, what we're going to talk about today are 4 things. First, why employee experience is a critical part of your 2025 plan. So we're going to talk a bit about the why. Then I want to talk about what, like what should we consider or think about when it comes to approaching creating these plans. Then I want to get into the how, right? How to approach budgeting and ROI. Like you're gonna have to defend these investments later at the end of the day. So I want to talk a bit about from a budgeting and ROI perspective, some considerations on what you could look at. And also the last is I want to share some planning tips and mindsets. So I have the luxury of working with HR folks all across the globe, seeing what sticks with them, what works, and I kind of bring it all together to identify some tips and mindsets that I've heard from different folks I've had the pleasure to work with. But before I do all that, just a quick introduction of who I am and why I'm passionate about this. But I spent the last 20 years building companies, right? Predominantly in the HR world, helping organizations build better workplaces. I am so passionate about building fantastic workplaces. My current organization is WorkTango, as you heard, but I have other communities like this where we bring together people to hear what's out there, and I just love the HR community and learning from each other. Now, from a role perspective, I've seen everything from building companies as a HR lead, as a CEO. And when I think about concepts of planning and budgeting and defending ROI, a lot of things I think are really critical, and I think it's so part of the process. But also, in my current role at WorkTango, I run the strategic planning process as well, which we're deep into right now to define what a success look like for 2025 and beyond. And lastly, just I'm actually from Toronto. I'm a huge Leaf fan. Unfortunately, they lost the opener yesterday, but we'll have a good season and blow it up in the playoffs as well. But wanted to just introduce myself a little more and kind of who I am, and my goal is to bring that wisdom of crowds of everything I've worked on to try to translate something that's valuable for all of you. So that being said, let's get started. Right? I want to talk about these 4 items. And first one, why employee experience is a critical part of your 2025 plan. But more importantly, the questions I like to ask are, one, why is employee experience critical? And second, like, why should we even care about it? Now, I could spend all day talking about this, but I want to just set the stage. Maybe you have buy-in already. Maybe you need that little nudge to say, well, why should I even think about an employee experience pillar in my strategic planning as an HR and people perspective? But I want to just kind of identify a few items. First thing I want to talk about is that I think it's really interesting that we are in a new wave of focusing on our employees, which is different the way organizations used to operate. So what you're seeing here is decades ago, organizations focused on what I'd call SRM, supplier relationship management. How do we know who our suppliers are? How do we make sure it's great experiences? How do we have all the data to make better decisions on building that better supply muscle? And then a couple decades later, it was all about CRM, customer relationship marketing. How do we know our customers, create great experiences for them, have all the data, make the decisions to have a great customer experience because we know that's going to translate to success. Decade later, really focus was on prospect relationship marketing, what I call PRM. Before people are even customers, how do we interact with them? How can they find us? How do we give them what they need, build great experiences before they become customers, and have all the data and insights to build that great experience and decisions? But again, I think we're in that wave now where it's more about ERM, employee relationship management, right? They're our biggest asset. They're our largest, number on the budget line. So organizations, if they aren't thinking about this whole employee experience shift, and I think many people are making that shift, it's happening, and we have to be honest with ourselves that we have to think about building experiences that are wonderful given the changes that are happening in our organizations, right? They're growing differently. Companies are reinventing approaches with AI and new technology. So we need to be intentional that employee experience is important, and when we create our plans and our strategies, that we're thinking about that as well. Now, this is just a story. This is trying to get people into the mindset that this is critical and important, but some people just need data, right? They need data to believe why we should care about this topic. So again, I could spend all day on it, but what I found really interesting in this Josh Bersin analysis was that good practices around employee experience can drive significant impact for businesses, for people, for innovation. And there was a great data around people outcomes. Like who doesn't want 5 times more likely to be a great place to work or sense of belonging or engage and retain employees? We know the impact of engagement and retention. We're always striving for that. But companies leveraging the right EX strategies, he also found in his research, is it's more than just the people outcomes. It's the business outcomes, right? See financial targets, right? Delight customers and even innovation. And today, with a lot of change happening in organizations, we need that level of innovation because what we used to do isn't going to work for what we want to do to grow. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of why and why we should care is I love sharing this story that when we think about the service profit chain, and if you're not familiar with this, that's really what it is, that many of our companies talk about, well, how do we build shareholder value? Right side of the slide. And maybe it's not shareholder value. Maybe it's whatever you define success as the outputs of the business. But you only get there when you have customers that are happy and come back and tell other people about their experiences. But the reality is customer success and shareholder value, those are outputs. You can't change those without the most critical inputs, which is what employees do every day, right? It's the thing, it's the services your employees provide. It's the products they build. It's the experience that really matters for them to have those levels of engagement and retention and build your organization. And too many companies, when they think about strategic planning, they forget that the employees are the inputs that are going to get us to our company success. So we started with why. I told you I wasn't going to spend a lot of time there because there's a lot to get to. So I want to get to what. And really, when it comes to what to consider to build a great experience, a great way I like to challenge HR leaders and business leaders are to think about what can you do in 2025 or any year for that matter of planning to be intentional around focusing on the right things that will improve the employee experience, right? What are the right things we should be doing? We could do anything, right? If we think about a blank slate of creating our budgets and our plans, year over year, we could literally do anything. But what are the right things to do? I wanted to share a bit of an idea with you. What you're seeing on the screen here is what I
Rob, I'm
call,
so sorry to interrupt you. I just
yeah.
wanted to jump in and say we cannot see your slides.
Oh, really?
Yes. Let's see if we can
Oh,
try sharing those again.
yeah. That's very, very odd. Let me try that again. They were beautiful slides.
I know, which is why I'm like, why am I not seeing these right now?
Let's see, share screen. Well, that's very, very sad. Um, Seeing if I can get into that again. Share. It was working before we even did it start with it all?
Okay, let me see. It looks like we're getting okay, so some folks, it might just be me. Thank you guys for coming into the Q&A. Some people are saying that they can see your slides.
Love it.
I can say that. Okay. I'm so sorry, guys. Maybe it was just me on my end being a panelist on here as well. Normally I can. Rob, I'm sorry to stop your flow. I'm gonna let you keep going.
I'm more relieved. I'm okay with it. And I'll show you the slides later. We'll have time to chat. Um, so basically what I was saying is, when it comes to what, there's a lot of things we can do to drive an employee experience. But the way I like to challenge business leaders and HR leaders is to think about when I think about the pillars that can drive employee experience, and I call this the employee experience solution spectrum, there are many things we can do that are very employee success focused versus company success focused. And again, some are debatable, but when I show this to most people, they kind of understand and agree with a lot of these and at a high level. But to build a great employee experience, Most companies unfortunately focus on the right-hand side. They make decisions to prioritize what makes the company successful, right? You only have so many resources and time and money. So if you're just focusing on the right side of this visual, it can really impact your employee experience in a negative way. And the point I want to make about this is performance management, right? From a performance management perspective, many companies focus on it, but think about it. It's fundamentally a way to ensure employees are doing what they're doing, right? Not for the purpose of them being successful, but also predominantly around defining compensation and defining promotion and structure in the world, right? When we think about approaching it. Now, I'm picking on performance management, but these are just things on the employee experience spectrum that we all can think about. Another thing is like we can spend all of our time and effort in 2025 updating our HRIS system. That's great. It serves the HR leader, but is it serving a better employee experience? And that can be debatable, right? Getting a new HRIS really doesn't add much value to your employees in many instances and cases. So to tug on this point a bit more, why I'm picking up performance management is because there's a lot of data out there, but 21% of employees agree that performance is managed in a way that motivates them to do outstanding work, right? It doesn't motivate them. I never meet the 21%. I meet the 79% of employees that think the performance management process is a waste of time and it's not about them being successful, right? They sit in those conversations waiting for their ranking because that's going to define what their compensation is, right? But the reason why I want to pick on performance management is if we think about the same spectrum of employee success and company success and look at how that can be applied to one strategy like performance management, there's different layers to it. So what you see here is, yes, things like performance appraisals and OKRs are really focused on the company success. But when you think about conversations and check-ins and the calibration part of it, that's really more focused on making the employee successful, not just about their performance management, but performance development. So I bring up this as an example because it's critical to be intentional about where we're choosing to focus our effort and time and budgets when it comes to our planning cycles. And again, I find a lot of companies still focus on the right-hand side. And it's why for the last 15 years, I'm at the same performance management conversations at events around the world. But I like bringing this up because if you were thinking about what your structure needs to look like, considering it this way is a good frame of mind or a good check-in or gut check with you and your team of where you can spend it. And I'm not saying that OKRs and performance appraisals are bad. I'm just saying in isolation, they're not valuable building a great employee experience without the things on the left-hand side. So last point on this I want to make is just to reiterate, when you think about what you will contribute to great employee experience, think about focusing on the left-hand side of what that planning should look and feel like. Now, that all being said, there are two critical enablers in what I believe companies should be focusing on. And no matter what you choose to do in your employee experience strategy and your plans and your programs, the two critical things of what we should focus on in this section are enable experience with technology and enabling our leaders. Now, we'll dive deeper into these in a bit, but in a nutshell, in order to get the most out of your company's efforts and investments in 2025 plans, you need these elements to be a part of your employee experience plan, right? You need these elements to be part of your strategy. So I want to talk about these two and kind of put in the context of why it's important and some considerations around your planning world. So first, let's start with technology. And I always ask HR leaders to say, what is your HR tech strategy? What's your HR tech budget? Do you have a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan? And I thought this was always important, but today, in terms of how AI is changing how we're using applications, not only for our employee experience, but across our organizations and our products and so on, are we having those conversations, right? Do we know what these are? And are we thinking about that and getting the discussion and alignment in the budgets to make these a reality? Or maybe it's not even getting the budgets. Maybe it's the trade-offs of leveraging technology to be able to have efficiencies in how you run your people programs and your experience programs. So more importantly, how are you leveraging technology as a part of this planning process? And if it isn't a focus for you now, I feel like you're a bit behind, right? In terms of making sure that we're thinking about how technology is going to play in to this experience. And the reason why I bring this up and I have a lot of conviction around it is that it, these investments actually get ROI. I had the pleasure of doing some research with Lighthouse Research and Advisory. We had 1,000 HR leaders provide insights on their experiences and investments and how they get ROI. And what they saw was a vast majority of companies generate a positive ROI from these types of investments. 93% of companies say software provides a positive or neutral ROI. And I'll use a quick example that everyone can relate to, right? Employee surveys, right? You probably run them in your company or you filled it out as an employee. And we've all done a survey, but something like technology, even if it's not, this specific ROI in terms of a budgetary line, like I've seen companies actually take the concept of listening to employees in a survey, understanding all the data, slicing it different ways to make value of it, getting it to leaders and acting on it, being 3.8 months versus adding technology to the mix and it being under 3 weeks. So think about that. From 17, that's 5 times more efficient in terms of just thinking about technology in a process versus a manual approach to, doing your employee surveys and listening to them and getting your leaders that data to them so that they can create plans to actually act on that. Right. 4 months later, employees feel like their voice isn't heard and action isn't taking place, or the sentiment is different. And again, not a great employee experience. So I'm just using one example, but the point I want to make here is that technology needs to be that critical part of your strategic planning and your budget carved out for these type of things if you want to impact that employee experience. Well, leaders also have a huge influence in driving great experience, which is the second part I want to talk about. But even though I started with technology, my last advice to you, and again, as a HR technology leader, is don't start with technology, right? If you have the strategic narrative in your process of knowing what's important to you to improve the employee experience, what success looks like, then you can plug in the right technology to enable it. So just don't get enamored on saying we're going to buy technology and throw it into our mix. Make sure it's really thoughtful about how that aligns to your strategic narrative, right? So again, what is the strategic narrative? And then the plans and budgets and tools and things needed in order to drive that to success. So that being said, the second critical enabler for ensuring leaders are a part of your plan and ensuring they're enabled is really critical to create a great employee experience. And I think a lot of companies talk about it and they know the leaders have a great experience, but we don't spend enough time thinking about the programs or the strategies and implementing them as part of the plans and the efforts required to do so. And again, we all know leaders have great impact, right? 3.4 more time, more engaged from employees who feel supported by their manager. 70% of the variance on employee engagement is from their managers. And again, this isn't just my personal recommendation, and yes, this is some data, but I found really interesting is recent study from Gartner this year showed what are the top 5 priorities for HR leaders in their research? And number one was leader and manager development, right? Companies are identifying this and understanding how do we drive success with our leaders because we know they're the linchpin. Like HR, you cannot solve all the world's problems on your own. We need the level of leaders to be able to drive that experiences for their teams and their departments, right? A one size fits all strategy on how HR is going to focus on driving success isn't going to work. So our leaders have to be a part of, I think, a important pillar in terms of our planning process. Another point I want to make here, as I looked at this, it wasn't just leadership and management development number one, but it highlights culture being key, right? HR tech as being a major third priority, right? Leader development obviously on there. And last year, the similar research, leadership development was at the top as well. So again, remember, all of these can be helped by employee experience, focus, employee experience software, and creating that part of your 2025 planning and budget process. So I wanted to kind of move on. Like we discussed the why. I want to give some considerations on what, right? Some of those items of the spectrum of employee experience, some of the critical enablers like technology and leadership. But I want to shift gears to a bit more onto the how, right? How to approach budgeting, how to approach defining ROI. And at the end of the day, you got to define ROI before you even get a chance to get budget and allocate it, right? So where I want to start was talk a bit about ROI and how you should be thinking of it to identify and validate budget that you might want to get right now. But also, if you're not starting that process, share some ideas on how I've worked with organizations to create a structure around measuring ROI and making a part of that narrative, as soon as possible. So where I wanted to go here in this section to start is that if you are measuring ROI, now's the time to start. And I want to discuss kind of different ways you can approach it, thinking about your investments, but also a more simple model based on the most common things that I've seen companies be able to accomplish. So where I want to go with this is there's 3 pillars of ROI to consider to start tracking for whether it's validating your budget for this year or getting your budget for future years. And those 3 key employee experience metrics to measure are what I call people ROI, HR ROI, and company ROI. And I'll dive each one of these briefly. But to give you some color, I don't think anyone's going to be too surprised about the first pillar, which is people ROI, right? It's why we're all in this profession. We love building great experiences for our people to drive success. But to establish ROI on any investment you're going to make on an employee experience strategy are these two things. And likely you're already measuring these, right? Engagement and retention. Um, but it's not just for your people metrics. It's also, we've seen the data, it translates to business ROI. It translates when you have higher engagement and retention into some of the other things you're trying to drive when it comes to customer satisfaction and shareholder value. But for both of these, it's really critical to have a baseline, right? And you also have to make sure we're measuring it more frequently than once a year, right? No one's going to act or do something different if you're only getting your engagement index or your measurement of how people feel once a year. And again, there's so many stories. I've worked with organizations that are, seeing huge increases in their engagement or ENPS or, Arrowhead reducing turnover by 49%, but it was about being intentional on what we're measuring, how it's impacting, and kind of lining that up to how we're running our programs and spending our budgets. You'll be surprised. Like this sounds table stakes to many people, but other organizations I've worked with either aren't measuring it or they're not time stamping it to the time that they're launching these new programs. I've had a lot of organizations, launch their employee experience strategy on month two, but month one is when they were doing their annual engagement measurement. And it's another 11 months until they actually roll something out where they can see the impact of these actions so they can refine it and make sure that employee experience gets better, right? Like think about it, every strategy, whether it's in HR, in marketing, in sales, you name it, you have to be agile to what's happening. So the process of measuring these things more frequently, understanding them and being able to navigate through change is a critical part. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because many organizations do measure these, but it's really critical. And I think low-hanging fruit to understand the impact of your employee experience strategy or your employee experience budget that you're investing. Now, that being said, I want to switch over to the second one and what I call HR ROI and how it impacts your HR team and your individuals that work day in and day out. And the two I often see and recommend are cost savings and HR efficiency. So cost savings, you might be saving, hard costs from changing vendors, right? It could be activity costs of using internal resources that you have. Or on the HR efficiency side, maybe you're saving time, speeding up processes, right? So you're focusing on doing other things. Sometimes I've seen it's just sentiment in how employees are reacting to HR initiatives or programs that are out there. So again, thinking about how are we going to track the ROI on any of our investments this year or next year is really critical. And this is another layer beyond retention and engagement. And again, I've seen this all the time. Companies saving. I worked with a company called Mouse Homes that just shifted their budgets around, say 25K just on conducting a new initiative. Or we work with a company called Skooks, hours and hours of effort to have a certain program done from a recognition reward perspective. Now things take 45 minutes on admin tasks. So when you start layering on, sometimes it's not just about driving engagement. There are some of the HR ROI that's also critical as well. So what I do recommend though is if you're not tracking any of these things today, calculate how many hours of your team's work means in dollars and cents, right? If you're spending 10 hours on an item and that's going to cost you, $50 an hour your time, maybe adding a new investment or shifting that investment actually supports just a better ROI in that type of investment. And the last one outside of HR ROI I want to mention is what I call company ROI. Now, there's so many examples of how companies can identify ROI, like impact on employee safety and efficiency and performance and so on. But two examples I see a lot of company focus on is customer satisfaction and performance and productivity. So for customer satisfaction, like what are your customer CSAT scores and correlations between teams or individuals that are engaged and have high employee experience scores and seeing what are those correlations like and validating some of the efforts. And again, I've worked with organizations where, RBFC, you saw increases in employees hitting customer service scores and started seeing locations that were implementing programs versus locations that were not. You could see a correlation to actually these type of programs hitting business metrics like customer sat. Right? And again, there's so many other examples here, and even the research I shared that we conducted earlier this year, 65% of organizations said investing in EX software improved their employees' productivity and performance. So bringing it full circle to the research here, and it kind of in summary, is that the end of the day, whatever you choose to do in 2025, you're going to have to validate. You're probably having to validate it now. And I see a lot of companies lean on these three pillars to make sure we can tell that story that whatever we're choosing to do, we know how we're going to find success, or we can share these type of metrics and identify if the investment is the right one, the wrong one, and navigate it from there. But you need data to make decisions. So again, this ROI approach is really critical to asking for budget or validating if it worked or not. So this seems standard, but as you plan for 2025, right, it's critical to not only how you're going to validate your investment, right, and what we talked about in terms of what you're going to do, but what I wanted to do is kind of just give a bit of a framework and simplicity to start with some key metrics that you could use. So in terms of how certain employee experience approaches have yielded ROI, what I wanted to also share was back to the study I'd mentioned. We actually use that in that research. We asked folks, which of the following technologies does companies use to help improve engagement and improve the employee experience? And what we found is performance management, recognition rewards, employee service, and listening. There was a large percentage of folks that actually saw that impact, right? But what's particularly interesting to me is that while many of these actions listed could happen without technology, right? There was still that level of investment in order to see impact in the organization. Now, what I found even more interesting from the research is employers whose revenue grew recently are more likely to be doing multiple things. So the point I want to make is if we think about employee experience and all those pillars I mentioned earlier, there really isn't a silver bullet. When companies are thinking of a multi-threaded experience strategy, again, we know you can't do it all, but be thoughtful on what are the right things that are employee focused versus company focused. We see that when they're doing multiple things, there's kind of this amplifier effect of seeing the ROI investments or improving the employee experience in general, but more importantly, driving revenue and business growth. Which leads me to one last point I want to make about this. As part of that research that I'm talking about, we learned that companies that was using the data, some of the ROI pillars I mentioned, and saw positive ROI, we realized it didn't take a massive investment. Two-thirds of companies that invested less than 10K saw benefits of 10K and 50K or more, right? That's a pretty impressive stat. Also, ROIs range, right? We've seen some companies see 40 to 50% got payback. We've seen some companies, about 35 to 45% of companies saw positive results, 2 times the investment, 3 times the investment. And lastly, investment in EX scales. Companies that invested a lot more, kind of 6 figures and above, saw more than 6 figures in benefit. So you might be having to go to the table and try to validate what you're trying to accomplish or get the budget for it. So I want to talk a bit about measuring ROI and the budget component on it as well. And like many of you, that's what we're trying to do right now. Define budget for next year. Hopefully it's increasing. You might have to decrease it, but just being really thoughtful around how do we approach the budgeting world to, again, that's going to be your baseline of what's going to drive ROI or not. So one example I like challenging folks with when they go through the planning process, and maybe you're familiar with this. I find most people more and more are getting familiar with this concept, is that think about your 2025 plan in what's called zero-based budgeting. And if you're not familiar with that, what it means is start today from scratch. Like, don't think about what you always used to do or what you did last year, what you're doing now. If you had to actually start things from scratch and blow up your HR team, your HR approaches, right? Or if you're in another department, whatever it is, what would you do starting from scratch and starting from zero? And it's a really great exercise to identify if we had to do really important things or we need to shift. Let's not think about the barriers that are reasons why we can't do it, right? Let's think about what's important and critical if we had to make that decision today, starting from the beginning. And it's a really good exercise to actually sit with your team and say, hey, if we just had a blank slate, what would that look like? And that's really great conversations when it comes into planning, because now it gives you a bit of ammo and ability and space to be innovative, to just not be stuck in the same things we're always doing. And we talked about it, right? Like if we continue to do the same things in this wave of technology change management, employee expectations, you name it, it's going to be really, really hard for us to build the experience that's really critical in what we want. So one example I want to share here that I see all the time, and I think it's a really, really great example and something we can all relate to, is that concept of service awards. I know we talked about years and the year of the snake, and I'm using the calendar theme here a lot, but I want to use this example because I find zero-based budgeting, or this concept of thinking your budget in a different way, it's a really good example to break the narrative and not do things we've always been doing, like annual service awards, right? 92% of companies do them. Majority of them start at 5 years. And we just do them because we've always been doing them. This was actually invented in the 1900s. Like 100 years later, companies are still doing this process because we've always been doing it. And I'm not saying it's not important to recognize folks for, you know, their years of service and the efforts and impact. But the reality is a lot of companies are taking different approaches, and I want to use this as one example and how I've seen companies make this shift. So, and not only make the shift to improve the employee experience, but even save money in the process, right? Which, we always want to do when we're thinking about our 2025 plans. So I want to use this as an example. This is how, and this isn't every company, but it's a pretty good representation of what I've seen when it comes to companies and their, years of service or employee rewards and recognition budget, is that they've typically start with the process of what I call legacy recognition. So there's milestone awards, like we talked about, the years of service for awards or their birthdays. There's usually nomination awards that companies have, right? Whether that's Employee of the Month or your company awards. Many companies invest in formal incentive programs. Maybe it's giving referral bonuses or sales incentives to the sales team. And then many companies, when you actually dig deeper under the layers, are just doing ad hoc spending. So, department gifts, random pizza parties, like people are just putting things on their credit card, and there's a lot of investment going in that. And again, I'm generalizing here, but what it typically averages out when you think about budgets for these recognition and reward strategies are typically split pretty heavy on the milestone side, and then there's the 20%, 15, 10. Again, it changes and all the time, but these are pretty typical benchmarks. Now, in the spirit of zero-based budgeting, in the spirit of trying to build better experiences, in the spirit even of trying to save money and getting more value out of our investment, a lot of companies have shifted their approach and see huge impact. So, for example, a lot of companies are saying, you know what, if we're going to reward people and spend most of our budget for effectively sitting in seat for the last 5 years, whether they're a great employee or not great employee, right? Let's take that down. Yeah, we can have smaller rewards to support those, but even do other things like recognition and other ways in a more free and non-cost component. But we don't want to rip away milestone awards, but we can spend significantly less, right? Automate the process, doesn't have to take a lot of time and effort. So a lot of companies are making that shift. Maybe they're doing the same nomination awards, similar programs as they have today, but a little smaller on the budget side. The incentive programs are pretty much the same. And then, ad hoc spending, let's try to eliminate that, right? How do we make sure there's no ad hoc so we track our budgets easier? We can build an equitable way people get recognized and rewarded across the business. But the reason why I share this, because a different mindset in the zero-based budgeting is a lot of companies are then saying, well, you know what? Let's actually leverage the budget that we had for some of these initial initiatives. Instead of a milestone award once every 5 years, or a nomination once a quarter or once a year on people's, getting Employee of the Month. Let's shift that into people getting recognized always on for the values, or a software to have pure recognition happen day in and day out, where there's no barriers to budget, right? People can give recognition all the time, which is valuable, and what gets recognized gets repeated. But think about recognition being one of the major drivers and impacts on employee experience and employee engagement. Effectively, companies are saying, let's just take a different approach to recognition rewards, get more value, which is we're still doing all the things and recognize rewarding people. They can get rewarded in other ways that are a bit more focused on how they come to work and show up, not just being at work. And at the end, seeing them doing all this by saving 15%. So again, this concept of zero-based budgeting is just rethinking some of the EX strategies you have in place today, and then thinking about how your budgets or your approaches can change, which can still see value, right? Again, I've seen this day in and day or time out and time out about in terms of, people saving money on their rewards and recognition strategies and actually seeing way more value in terms of how it impacts engagement, building a culture of recognition, and so on. So this is just one of the examples, again, we think about ROI and budgets that I want to share. One last thing I want to share when it comes to budgets, and maybe something valuable for you, is recent research this year showed, like, what does HR spend as a percentage of revenue? And again, the mean is there and it's based on different industries, but I think it's important to know this and share that, right? Your executives love benchmarks, right? How do we go in if we're really under that benchmark to say there's some expectations of how we should be investing more? in our people, in our employee experience, and some of the ammo you could use as part of that budgeting and planning process. So that being said, we talked a bit about the why, we talked a bit about the what, right? Just how to approach budgeting and ROI, which are big parts of how you create your plan to to hit the outcome of better employee experiences because we know they're critical. But I want to just end it with what I mentioned was where do we start? Right. Again, I always am talking to HR leaders and ask them to reflect on the year past or the 5 years past. And I always say, listen, what are some of the things that looking backwards you realize that was the thing you should have focused on earlier, or what was a trigger to success. And I've consolidated that into 7 planning tips and mindsets as you go through this process now or in the near future. So I'll dive into these, but before I do, one quick funny anecdote I wanted to share. I always love having themes and bringing up these types of just different conversations in these sessions, and also make sure you're all still paying attention. But back to the concept of calendars and years of service. Has anyone heard of the birthday paradox? Um, and if you haven't, it's so interesting. And what the birthday paradox says is that if you have the probability of someone sharing your specific birthday is if you have 23 people in the room, is 5.9% that someone shares your birthday. And that's kind of what we call a one to many. But if you take 23 people, any random, put them in the room, there's actually a 50.7% chance that 2 people share a birthday. Now, we're not in person today. I typically would ask people to, shoot it over to me or kind of see how many people are in each month. And it's true. It's a very interesting, unbelievable paradox that's out there. But it's just some random insight to share on the call today that you can share with anyone else in your network. But anyways, I want to share this antidote, but I also want to lead into the first mindset is that employees work in days and not years, right? If your employee experience plan or structure or strategy includes an annual survey or recognizing every 5 years or an annual appraisal process, you will not create an employee experience, right? Your companies move too fast. Employees do not want to wait 364 days to get recognized. We need feedback loops and diagnostic feedback to build a better experience. So again, we have to be thinking outside of the annual processes because employees don't work in days. They work in days, not in years. So that's the first mindset. The second mindset, I think it's really important as a full holistic employee experience strategy is that the employee experience goes beyond onboarding. When I talk about employee experience, it's not just the bottom two of what their working experience is, like how does work get done in your organization, which heavily influences the moments that matter in your company, or what I call the success experience, which is all the initiatives to try to engage people at work. A lot of those EX pillars, your brand experience and your candidate experience, those are part of the employee experience, right? People come to your organization with a mindset of how your employee experience is, even if they're never going to work there or interview there, right? It might get them to the door. It might be a selection whether they want to talk to you or not. But as you're thinking of your EX strategy in general, what are we doing from our brand to make sure that people understand that employees matter? We conduct these certain initiatives. We create a place of belonging. Like thinking about that and getting it out there is really when your employee experience starts and how you treat people through the candidate experience, another huge level and layer to upskill your employee experience strategy. So that was the second. Third, we have to, I think we understand this from an HR perspective, but we have to convince our executives, our leaders that EX isn't only HR's job, right? If you think about a business strategy and an HR strategy and an employee experience strategy, it shouldn't be running like this up a chain. There's a business strategy and people strategy, and leaders in the organization need to take ownership. It's only until then where everyone owns the employee experience, right? We manage as a leadership team, whether it's your executive leaders, your second levels, your third levels, and get them a part of the process of what's working and what isn't, right? So when we make them part of the conversation, we make them part of the plan, we make them accountable for the things that need to happen, that's when we start seeing success. So it's just a mindset when I speak to a lot of HR leaders, and this gets back to a bit of the leadership and enablement enabler that we talked about. It's not just your job. We have to have your leaders understand that. Fourth major kind of thought or consideration is what is your HR annual theme or your vision of success? What's your HR mission statement? What are you defining as the purpose and direction of your HR organization for 2025? Is there a clear direction? What's your role in the company's success? And there's so many examples out there, and I hate slides that have a lot of content on it, so apologies for this. But one of the things that really stood out to me, and this is Adidas's 2023 report, is they identify pillars to seek to focus their efforts on people and culture. So DE&I, attracting and retaining talent, right? Building leaders, create a premier experience, continuous learning and rewarding, recognizing. What I think was really critical is the paragraph at the bottom. They're basically setting the tone for what's important and what they want to prioritize in 2023, which was, yes, develop a culture, but supported by 6 values we just introduced. How do we include them in all our people policies and processes? The way we hire, the way we promote, the way we evaluate performance. So, are there critical things that you believe need to be woven into your plan, into your focus, into your employee experience? And I find that if you can set the tone with some level of theme or mission, it's really critical and important. So that's the fourth tip in mindset. The fifth that's a little related is that the reality is Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is your HR legacy. You can't do all the things on the employee experience spectrum. You can't have, all your mission statement solve all your problems. But in the same way Rome wasn't built in a day and bricks were being laid every hour and every day and every week, you may not even be able to do it all in 2025. So how do you create a strategy that's a 1-year plan and a 3-year plan? How do you create quarterly themes? How do you maybe have only 1 or 2 transformations, just like Adidas did in 2025 and then 2026, and see the impact of those? So again, I find people trying to boil the ocean with doing everything, and that's really critical with the resources that we have. So that's the fifth. The sixth, and I think really interesting mindset and feedback I've received from HR leaders in their planning process was that they used consumer principles. What I mean by that is I always show this chart. I love it. And what it says is look at your own organization and what are you doing for your customer relationships? Kind of where we started the conversation today. And we do things to engage our customers and personalize it for them and listen to them and loyalty programs so they never leave us and service and support them so they love their experience. Well, why aren't we doing the exact same things when it comes to our talent? Right? So what do we do to engage our employees and personalize things for them, right? Recognize and reward them, like service and support our employees so they never leave. And I find what's interesting here is your marketing and your customer teams are doing things that we can learn, but also as you're going through your budget process, ask how much budget is being spent on your customer systems versus your talent systems. In many cases, it's over 10x. And this might give you some ammo to identify in the spirit of what we talked about earlier as things starting with the employee experience to get to customers' experiences, to get to greater companies' growth. I think it can be a good narrative to try to validate why this is so important. And the last, and one of my most fun tips that I've heard is what I call think about how to leverage R&D. And R&D does not mean research and development. It means rip off and duplicate. Your other companies are doing cool things that you could just steal. Take them, make them your own, put them in your own culture and voice and wrapper and update it to your specific employee base. But the reality is, talk to other HR leaders, find out what's working, read different articles, right? I'd love that you're all here because you're here thinking about what else can I do that's differently. So rip off and duplicate, make it your own. And I think if you can get inspiration from what's happening out there, it might be not only easy to kind of steal, but you can lean on and understand how do people implement it? What landmines should be avoided and so on. So with that being said, that's what I wanted to wrap up with today was that, we talked a bit about all the major components of why and what and how, and I just wanted to share some insights in terms of what I've been hearing in my processes at our own organizations or other ones I work with. So really, really appreciate everyone's time and effort and happy to take questions. I just saw you came back, Emily.
Yeah, hi. No, I've been here the whole time, listening in, having my tea. Okay, so you provoked quite a few questions from the audience. I believe the most recent one that came in, you just mentioned systems, I think in context of what other companies are doing. I'm asking you this one first because it's a little bit vague. Are there any systems you recommend? Writes Karen. I believe this person is talking about systems that other companies use.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very biased question to ask because WorkTango provides systems when it comes to building a better experience, whether it's things we talked about like recognition or surveys and listening to employees. But I think what I think my suggestion gets back to earlier is one, how do you define what's the most critical part of the experience and what pillar do you want to focus on? Maybe L&D, it might be building culture of recognition, whatever it is. And then once defining what success looks like, then looking at what are the right technologies and what do you need to make that a reality. And I think that's when you can start entertaining, talking to 3 or 4 different companies there and see what's working. And also, right, lean on your R&D, right? Find out what your colleagues or partners are using in other organizations. So I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend WorkTango in that question. So based on what I do and where I come from, but I thought giving it answering it a different way might be helpful.
All right, the next question for you is from Angela, who writes, do you believe that employees will feel like it's takeaway if you are decreasing the milestone awards? This is something you brought up maybe about halfway through, companies having done this for more than 100 years. At the 1 year mark, at the 5 year mark, this person wants to know if you get rid of those or people kind of
Yeah.
they're missing something great.
That's a great question. So I'll tell you, like I've been at companies and I hit my 5 year and like honestly, like my 10 year, nothing you're gonna give me is if it's $250 or five is can replicate or provide the value that you provided for a decade of your life. So many organizations, their budgets actually aren't that large that make huge impact. That being said, when I've seen companies make that shift, what the communication is saying, listen, even though we've decreased what the milestone awards is. Remember, you're only getting that in many cases every 5 or 10 years, right? So you have to be here that long. We've translated that budget to the other kind of value rewards. So people, you have opportunity day in and day out to earn effectively the same rewards and the same currency, but you can actually start building those even beyond what your milestone award would have been. So I think the idea is it's taking smaller individual moments, but spreading them out across or shorter and longer time periods, so you have more recognition and reward moments, which I think is more impactful than rewarding people once a year. Um, Now, I wouldn't change the level of recognition. Like in fact, like pomp, circumstance, like create as big as you can to recognize these great accomplishments, and you don't have to need a lot of budget to do that. But that's how I've seen that narrative is, hey, we're actually moving the budget for what we're rewarding people. We're just doing it in a way you're going to get rewarded and recognized.
All right. The next question for you is this. How can organizations prioritize which employee experience initiatives to fund within a very tight budget?
Yeah. So if you think about a lot of those employee experience pillars, a lot of them are effectively what drive engagement and experience, right? Learning and development, career path, and you name it. I always like to say start with data, right? So if you can get a feeling of your organization on what's working, like what you're doing today, where the gaps are, and we use statistical analysis to say it's not just what the lowest score is, but this will have the biggest impact and influence in driving things that are important to you, like your engagement index or your ENPS scores. Now you have the voice of employees who are part of the process of telling you what's important to them and what's working and isn't. And now you have a data model to tell you this is actually what statistically would move the needle for you. And I think that's better than just assuming what we should do. And it gets back to what I mentioned earlier is also you're going to launch something and it's not going to be perfect. So then ask them before and after what's hitting, what do you like about this, what do you don't, and then if you have to be selective and only choosing one of the pillars or you're constrained from a budget perspective, then it's a little easier to just choose one that's going to be most impactful. Last thing I'll say on that though is a lot of the things we talk about here don't need a lot of budget, especially if you're a smaller organization, right? You can build recognition cultures and meetings every week with the organization, right? You could make sure for not performance management, it's focusing on career development. So I think there's ways you can infuse that without a lot of budget. It's just obviously a little more manual. It's obviously harder to measure those types of items, but hopefully that's helpful, just food for thought in terms of let data make the decision for you.
Our next question comes from an attendee who writes anonymously, and they ask, you mentioned that technology is, excuse me, a critical enabler, but what if you can't afford new technology?
I don't think you can afford not to have technology in today's age. I think it's less about adding costs. It's more about how does your investment change the ROI kind of equation? So think about it, right? Like you might have a team of three HR people and you're a small company. You might get away with two with all the time and effort saved by investing in technology, right? So I think there are elements where those are hard decisions, but you may not have budget for it, but you might have it. You just have to shift it from people. Now, what I said earlier is you can still make impact if you don't have the budget for technology, and the answer in the last question. But that would be my thought or advice there, where if you get back to zero-based budgeting, right, you just have to make harder decisions in order to drive more structure. And the reality is when I said you can't afford not to do it, that's where the world's going, right? Like the level of efficiency that companies are getting from these types of new technology, we can't be laggards, as everyone else is running fast beyond us.
All right. Another attendee is wanting to know about measurement. So they write, what benchmarks or KPIs should be used to measure the success of my employee experience plan?
Yeah, well, I think those three ROI pillars are where I lean to. Yes, is it driving your engagement of your team and retention? Like, is it helping your HR team be more efficient? And then the company, like, is there correlation of what you're doing to anything that matters to your company? Like I said, it could be safety, it could be sales, it could be customer sat, whatever it is. Like, I think those are the three items that I brought up because that's what I would recommend. It may not be easy on day one. You have to be selective on what are the things you want to look at. But I think if you're measuring that, that's where rubber hits the road. Too often companies they measure adoption of their program. It's like, no one cares how many followers you have. They care about how many people bought your product, right? Similar, like if if so many people downloaded the app that you installed, but they didn't use it, like, I think there's a lot of surface metrics that people need to get away from. So I would focus more on the ROI ones. Now, you might not have that for the first 3 to 6 months, and that's okay. Like, what are the early indicators? And maybe it is adoption, but I think it's a journey. And actually, my team, as a follow-up to this webinar, is providing a fantastic template for you all to actually use. It'll be in PowerPoint. You can enter in your numbers, and it's all these different things I'm talking about. And I think if you take a look at that, you could leverage it. And that's kind of our recommendation of where you could start.
All right. How about this one, which is related? This audience member writes, how and when do you recommend communicating my HR ROI metrics to my team?
Yeah, I think when I say my team, I mean I think about my HR team, I think my executive team, I think about my leaders. Like I think it's all really the same, but I think it's important to build a rhythm. But hey, every quarter we're going to give an update of the key things. We might not have the data on quarter one, but we'll have it on quarter two. Um, I think that rhythm's important because it sets accountability for us to make sure that we're going to get and understand and share that data. And I think quarterly makes sense, just given how fast our organizations move. One thing I will say though is I don't care who you share the data with, but one thing that changed my perspective and how I share data with anyone in an organization is I was once, I'll tell you the quick story. I was, kind of earlier in my career, I had a leader tell me, Rob, you have to share the art of data or no one will listen to you. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Like, what's the art of data? Like, I'm confused. It's like, you have to share the art of data or just get out of the room. And I realized what art meant. And it was an acronym for absolute, relative, and trend. And the idea was that if you show an absolute number to your executive team or your HR team, and it says engagement is 65%. So so what? Like 65%, what does that mean? Well, relative, maybe it's relative to another department or relative to a benchmark of other organizations. Now I have more context and the picture, right, the art starts to become a little clearer. And the T is trend. If it was 40 last time, that's a great number. If it was 90, not going in the right direction. So I don't care who you share it with, do it quarterly, share it with your whole team if you want. But if you don't have the art of data and that metric, it won't have the same level of painting the right picture that you want a wonderful piece of art to show.
Rob, thank you so much for being here. It's always nice to see you. Always a pleasure
Likewise.
to speak to you. And thank you for sharing all your practical, very positive advice and the research that you do and that WorkTango and the great products that you create. Thank you again to WorkTango for your support and to all of our audience members for participating today. Great questions that came from you guys. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. You will receive your SHRM HRCI codes via email in about 24 hours. And before signing off, I'm going to drop the link again to some complimentary VIP tickets to our virtual conference coming up later this month on October 16th about modernizing your workplace for a more flexible, inclusive era. I will be there. I hope you all will be too. So, on behalf of all of my colleagues at From Day One, thank you for participating. Stay well and bye for now.
Take care, everyone.